Hi, everybody. I'm Jeff Weiss, co-chair of Steptoe's International Trade Policy Practice and lead of the firm's supply chain team. Welcome to Supply Chain University, where we dive into the legal, policy, and advocacy issues involving supply chains. To find out more, visit our website at steptoe.com. In this episode, we're talking with Jimmy Goodrich, Vice President for Global Policy at the Semiconductor Industry Association. In that role, Jimmy leads SIA's global policy team and works to advance SIA's international competitiveness, trade, China policy agenda, as well as supply chain. So thanks so much for joining us, Jimmy. Really excited to have you here on the program.
It's a pleasure to be here, Jeff. Thanks for the invitation.
So before we get into the discussion on supply chain issues, I was wondering whether you could give us an overview of who SIA represents and its mission and key priorities.
Well, great. So the Semiconductor Industry Association that I work for, we are the primary trade association for the chip industry here in the United States. In fact, we represent 98% of U.S. headquartered chip firms. So collectively, we think we, have a very good representative view of what the industry's priorities are, challenges, and other key issues. We're located here in Washington, D.C. We're a small group, around 13, 15 permanent staff, but we like to think we punch above our weight class in terms of the effectiveness of advocacy on behalf of our industry. And we work on everything from domestic tax, regulatory, to research development, workforce, to international trade and supply chain issues. As you can imagine, with so much focus on our industry over the last couple of months, last year, and I think moving forward as more and more people understand just how foundational our technology is, it just means there's more responsibility on our part to advocate for our industry and educate the public about what we do and the unique aspects of our sector.
It's a bit of an unfair question, but can you provide an overview of the semiconductor supply chain? I realize that's probably not an easy thing to do in 2 minutes.
It's a complex industry, that's for sure. And, in fact, that's probably one of the biggest challenges that we have with policymakers, the public, is just simply educating folks how our industry works and where the supply chains are. So we are probably one of the most global industries, period. In fact, there's about $1.4 trillion in global trade in semiconductors. It's one of the most traded goods after energy products and refined oil. And there's no one country or company that's able to produce a chip on their own. It truly is a diverse global supply chain that's able to produce innovation. It's basically, how do you make those microchips? It's a complex process of the research development involving universities and research institutes, the chip design, where you take all the different circuits and you use complex software and place them on a silicon wafer. Then we move to the manufacturing process, where those designs are put on the wafer, fabricated in these $20 billion, sometimes even more, manufacturing facilities called fabs. And then they finally get chopped up, assembled, and packaged and sent off into the global electronic supply chain, consumed into your mobile device, your PC, laptop, server, data center, autonomous vehicles, wind energy equipment, you name it. Semiconductors are everywhere. And that's really the key thing about our industry, is it's truly foundational. There isn't anything with a digital on-off switch that doesn't have a semiconductor device in it. It's ubiquitous in our life today.
So it sounds like the use of imported inputs and components, that's something that's going to happen as a matter of course. And when the product moves across borders, a lot of that's going to be intra-company trade, right?
So it's intercompany, inter-supply chain trade. So even, for example, we have kind of two big types of companies in the semiconductor industry from a business model perspective. There are those that are vertically integrated, called integrated device manufacturers, think Intel, Micron, or Samsung. And then you have companies that just specialize in different stages of the supply chain. Some might just do the design, or some might just do the manufacturing, or some might just do the outsourced assembly test. And there's a lot of trade in between all those different nodes of the supply chain, both up and downstream and within the chip supply chain itself. So it's incredibly complex. For a chip to be produced, it might be might travel around the world 3 or 4 times before it actually ends up inside the phone that you're using. So it's an incredibly amazing and complex process. And you might have times where your competitor is also your supplier, but your supplier is also your competitor. It's a fun industry to be in just because of all of its unique aspects to it.
So, given how complex the supply chain is, I'm wondering, there must have been at least an example or two you can think of where maybe a particular regulator somewhere didn't understand the supply chain and maybe took some policy action that created unintended obstacles.
We've had a lot of that. For example, one famous U.S. policymaker, who shall name undisclosed, once asked us, well, your industry can make a semiconductor, but what about a full conductor? Those would be pretty innovative. So the level of understanding about our industry, frankly, has increased significantly since that statement was made several years ago. And actually, we found overall that because of the attention in the media from policymakers, that more people just know kind of the key aspects of our industry than they did before. So that's really great. So the risks, though, if you don't understand how our supply chain works, how global it is, we do sometimes, fall into situations where not very optimal policy solutions are produced. So in the last administration, a good case in point is when the tariffs were placed as part of the 301 investigation on imports of goods from China. Tariffs were proposed to be placed on semiconductors imported from China. But the way our supply chains work, again, deeply global, many of those chips are actually not Chinese semiconductors coming into the United States, but chips from American, European, or Japanese firms who do their final stage of assembly, test, and packaging in China that are then imported into the U.S. for downstream manufacturing to be assembled into a car or a robot or a John Deere agricultural device. And so we were basically, in that case, because we didn't truly understand how our supply chain's working, putting tariffs on some of our own products that were coming into our own industrial and manufacturing sectors of the United States. So we weren't just harming the chip sector, we were also harming the downstream users who depended on those American chips across the U.S. manufacturing sector. After we, went through a process of educating a lot of the policymakers about our supply chains, I think that led to a new understanding and a more targeted approach.
What about COVID? Has that impacted the industry's supply chains? Are there any logistical issues that you had to deal with? I know there are still shortages and so many different things right now.
Well, our industry has been, uniquely impacted by COVID, much like many other sectors across the global economy. When the pandemic hit in early 2020, that really sent shockwaves across the supply chain. You had countries going into lockdown in China, Southeast Asia. So from a supply perspective, you had some really big jolts to the supply chain, particularly in Southeast Asia and East Asia, where a lot of the countries went into those lockdowns for extended periods of time. At the same time, however, everyone was going into work from home, stay from home, school from home, and people were purchasing all sorts of new laptops and phones and TVs, speakers, Bluetooth microphones, headsets to be able to keep the sort of digital economy moving. And so demand for semiconductors shot through the roof in the second half of 2020. Some parts of the economy, however, drastically reduced their demand for chips, as when you were all staying from home, no one was driving their cars, so the auto industry projected that there weren't going to be any new cars built or cars sold over the next couple of months. But what took people by surprise is that sales of cars also rebounded at the end of last year in a very dramatic way, going from negative growth to double-digit growth in demand. But when they wanted to buy chips to be able to build their cars, many of those chips were not available on the market because they had already been consumed by the huge explosive growth that was happening in all these consumer electronics sectors. And, trying to buy chips is kind of like getting in line at the DMV for a new driver's license. If you step out of line, you go back to the end. You can't just cut in place and try and get ahead of everyone else. So that's led to a lot of constraints in the supply chain, and now you've got this shortage of semiconductors that's been ongoing for the last 7-9 months now, and it's really, I think, going to continue to roll on through the next couple of months and into early 2022. And that's been difficult for some sectors of the economy, like autos, where they haven't been able to produce as many cars as they think they can sell. They've had to furlough some of their workers. But it's not just the auto industry. The shortage is impacting everyone, from schools trying to buy laptops to even if you're trying to purchase a new washer or dryer right now, there's a 30 to 60 day delay because of shortage of key microelectronic parts. But the semiconductor industry, though, is working as hard as it can to try and boost output. But unfortunately, semiconductors, because the manufacturing process is so complex, we can't just flick a switch and triple, quadruple output immediately. It takes around 30 to 45 days for a chip to be built. So that supply is going to be coming onto the market in a staged way and increasing significantly, to which now the semiconductor industry is shipping more chips than we did in 2019 before the pandemic, including to the auto industry at record numbers. So we're doing as much as we can to get supply into the industry as quickly as possible.
It sounds like one lesson learned is think twice about getting out of line, right?
Well, that, and also, the auto industry and many other parts of the manufacturing sector here in the U.S. run a just-in-time inventory. And just-in-time inventory in a perfect world where you have no disruptions to supply and demand works great. You don't have any inventory, the parts roll up to the factory, and you build them that day as the parts arrive, and you have a car coming out of the factory within 3 days. However, if you have a severe disruption, that throws the whole just-in-time inventory process into disarray. And I think we've seen that some companies, for example, in East Asia, some Japanese automakers who've had experience with natural disasters like earthquakes and tsunamis in Japan, they've actually built up an inventory, and they've done much better throughout this crisis than some other firms have. So I think that's going to be a big takeaway, is supply chain management, having some form of a inventory that's more than just zero inventory is going to go a long way to help buffer companies against these type of shocks to the supply chain. But also, I think it's led to a rethink around just how vulnerable we are in terms of supply chains in key regions outside the United States. During the pandemic, when Americans found out that we couldn't produce the personal protective equipment, the masks, the gowns, or ventilators to keep people safe and healthy, and much of that supply came from China or other parts of the world that, frankly, people are questioning now whether or not that's a secure and stable source of supply. So that's now led to others thinking, well, if we're worried about medical devices and personal protective equipment, we too should be worried about just how secure our domestic supply of semiconductors is. And that's led to a huge conversation around onshoring, reshoring, and whether or not we need to be doing more production here in the U.S. And the short answer is yes, and there's a huge effort underway to try and make that happen.
Yeah, it sounds like, besides COVID, there's also, natural disasters, geopolitical developments like 301. It seems like the congestion that we're seeing now at U.S. ports, the estimates are that it's going to last well into next year. There's also a possibility of cyber attacks. So, I'm wondering, you've given some thoughts about what companies can do to prepare themselves to be more resilient. What do you think the federal government should do to help alleviate some of this congestion we're seeing?
That's a great question. So fortunately, most of our product is shipped via air freight. So the only issue that we've had is just trying to get bookings of, commercial cargo air freight lines. It's in high demand right now, just like all modes of transportation are, but trying to have the sort of transportation infrastructure keep pace with our industry is always a challenge, but the air freight companies actually do a tremendous job. The bigger issue, I think, is really around how do we longer term look at our supply chain, because we have some serious vulnerabilities. This should be a wake-up call for policymakers. If you think the chip crisis is in a severe issue now, just think what it would be like if we couldn't get access to chips coming out of a whole country or region in East Asia, like Taiwan. For example, Taiwan today produces 92% of all the world's advanced chips at 10 nanometers and below. Those are the most advanced chips that go into your smartphone or your supercomputer. And East Asia accounts around, in total, 80% of semiconductor manufacturing overall. So we're incredibly exposed to, whether it's natural disasters, geopolitical tensions, or other type of global international events that can disrupt our supply chains. In fact, we did a study that found if for some reason we weren't able to purchase chips from Taiwan for up to a year, that could be up to a $500 billion negative hit to the electronics industry alone. That's not even just looking at what the fallout impact would be on the global economy. It would be devastating. Wow. So, the key answer we think is not to be, self-sufficient and build everything within our borders. That's not possible in today's globalized world, but we can do things to make our supply chain more resilient. Fortunately, the Biden administration earlier this year conducted a 100-day review of supply chains. One of those key sectors they looked at was semiconductors. They had about a 200-page report. Of that, about 40 was on the chip industry. And I think many of their conclusions were very sound. Said, we need to gradually reduce our dependence on some regions like in East Asia. We need to build up our domestic supply chains, but we also need to do that in partnership with our allies. Essentially, for example, there's key gaps and vulnerabilities in our supply chain where in some areas we're very strong, others we're weak. We should focus on the weak areas, work with our allies, work with our domestic industrial base to try and build up those capabilities so that we can buffer ourselves against future supply chain disruptions. And we can do that in a way where we're strengthening our role within the global supply chain, not building walls around us. And that means being pragmatic about what should be produced here, what should be produced in allied countries. I think it's called nearshoring, friendshoring is kind of the term now.
Right.
And focusing where we can make a difference, like on the really cutting edge of technologies, whether it's in contract chip manufacturing, memory chips, or other areas.
So I was going to ask you about, whether or not the administration should strive to reshore the entire semiconductor supply chain within the United States. I think you've answered that question pretty firmly. I'm wondering, though, how do we operationalize? Have you given any thoughts to how we operationalize a policy of nearshoring or friendshoring in a way that makes sense, and figure out how much capacity should we have here? And like you said, it's a global supply chain, so maybe it's not every single step. Maybe it's some of the steps, and some of the steps are elsewhere. Have you all given thought to how that might work from a policy perspective?
Yeah. So, again, trying to build everything on our own is impossible. In fact, we found in a study that trying to rebuild, the entire global supply chain within the United States would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. And actually, if every nation was a balkanized sort of island of chip production, it would increase costs by 40 to 60% of chips worldwide. And that's just something that for the global economy is untenable. But on the other hand, we can try and achieve a baseline level of, we call minimum viable manufacturing capacity, so that in the event of a crisis, we have enough technology and capacity on U.S. shores to be able to sustain our critical infrastructure, our military, our first responders, key sectors like financial services, energy, water, oil, transportation. That comes out to around a third of demand for chips in the United States, which is about 8% of global chip demand. And in some areas, we have sufficient supply to meet that, but in many areas, we do not. In fact, in order to try and achieve that baseline level of manufacturing capacity, we think the federal government should invest around $50 billion in 10 to 15 new chip facilities across the United States in a diverse range of technologies and product segments. Fortunately, there is a bipartisan bill that was passed by the Senate, the U.S. Innovation and Competitiveness Act, that specifically allocates $52 billion for the semiconductor industry, of which around 40 is directly for chip manufacturing. So pretty close to what we think is necessary to help improve the resiliency of our supply chains. The Biden administration has come out sort of full-throated support. Biden himself has hosted chip makers for a virtual summit at the White House. Secretary Raimondo at the Commerce Department is a big supporter of this effort. And now we're really just awaiting the House to take action and work together with the Senate to try and get this across the finish line. So we're kind of at a historic moment here where for decades, Washington thought, industrial policy was the word that shall not be spoken. And now we're, on the precipice of actually moving forward, doing our own industrial policy. I think, though, in a targeted way that's really market-based, meaning that at the end of the day, it's going to be commercial private firms that are still undertaking the majority of the risk. And that, if a chip factory today costs $20 billion and the federal government might come in with a $1 to $3 billion match, 70, 80% of that risk is still undertaken by the market. And our hope is that this is going to be a good way to help spur production here because at the end of the day, the U.S. is not competitive any longer when it comes to chip manufacturing. In fact, virtually every other key, industrialized nation from Europe to those in East Asia, they provide heavy incentives for their domestic chip manufacturing. And it's a global world. If we don't provide those incentives, U.S. or other multinational companies, they just won't invest here. They're going to invest where those incentives are the strongest. So we need to level the playing field and make the U.S. competitive again. And we think the CHIPS Act is going to do that. And we think the funding level is sufficient enough to help us close some of those gaps in our supply chains.
And I know there's been a proposal to provide, Commerce with funding and create a new supply chain resiliency office. And USTR has been charged with creating a strike force to tackle supply chain issues. I'm wondering, and again, I worked at both agencies, and, not a major focus at USTR. That was always seen as an issue that other agencies handled. So I thought that was great to see that they're going to be given a larger role. Commerce, I worked on this with Secretary Pritzker, and it was very hard to get people's attention on these issues. And we certainly, at that time, and not within the agency, but across the street, unless there was kind of something urgent happening. And it certainly wasn't relating to reshoring. It would be, if there was a problem at a port or with a shipping line. So it's obviously, like you said, this is game changing, the things that they're thinking about. Do you have thoughts about what Commerce and USTR might do? Those new authorities.
Well, again, hopefully the House is going to pass them and they actually have those authorities. But I think the anticipation is that sometime before the end of this year, maybe first half of next year, that's going to happen. There's tremendous bipartisan support across the aisle for these type of initiatives. And really, it's about how do we frame the competition with China? How do we strengthen the resiliency of our supply chains? And at the end of the day, out-innovate and run faster than our competition. On the Commerce and USTR side, Commerce is going to have a huge increase in their budget if all these bills are passed. We're talking about $52 billion to the chip industry that the Commerce is going to have to implement. They have other programs. Those all easily exceed the total Commerce annual operating budget by an extremely wide margin. So they're going to have to bring in the right people, create new offices, work with the industry closely to formulate rules to ensure that these new initiatives are done in a transparent way, in a thoughtful way, strategic way, and also one that engages the private sector and our allies. So that's a very tall task that they have in front of them, and I know the administration's thinking about this and is trying to put together a plan. And then on the USTR side, I think there's still kind of an evolving understanding of what sort of this new trade strike force is going to be, what the role for trade enforcement will be, trade policy in regards to supply chain issues. Because right now, frankly, a lot of the governments, whether it's the European Union, South Korea, the United States, we're very focused on what's happening domestically within our supply chains. And I think there's a real big need for us to coordinate with our allies to ensure that we're not going to undercut each other in some of our incentive policies, that we don't unleash some, sort of anti-competitive forces, or we don't somehow by these government programs create excess non-market capacity? What are some principles for collaborating cross-border? There's a lot of room, I think, that both Commerce and USTR can engage with their allies on. In fact, at the end of the month, they have this upcoming Trade and Technology Council with the European Union, where I think many of these issues are going to be discussed. So there's a lot of work to be done, but it's exciting, and it's all, I think, for a very important cause.
Yeah, I'm noticing in addition to TTC, there are a few other supply chain dialogues that the administration has kicked off, and it'll be interesting to see how they use those. You also mentioned China, and you talked about the tariffs earlier on in the discussion. Wondering what you think about what the administration ought to do next with respect to China, specifically Phase 2. Should they seek to reengage and negotiate Phase 2 bilateral trade agreement, and what should be contained in that agreement?
Well, so China absolutely is one of our biggest challenges. In fact, China is the largest market for semiconductor sales worldwide. Around 36% of all chip sales somehow flow through China. That's not just the Chinese companies. Global companies like Apple, Dell, HP, a lot of them have deep supply chains in China. So it's just as many sales to global companies as it is to domestic Chinese firms within inside the China market. But at the same time, China poses serious challenges for our economy, our nation, and the semiconductor industry as well. In fact, China has a stated goal to be independent and self-sufficient in semiconductors. They are investing tens of billions, over $100 billion, into their domestic industry with generous subsidies to their domestic firms. We have issues relating to market access, intellectual property protection, on a number of other kind of key issues. So the balance that really needs to be struck is how do we address the trade issues, the security issues appropriately, but how do we also ensure that access to the China market remains open? And that's really important for our industry because one thing I didn't mention is that our sector is one of the most R&D intensive industries, period. Around a fifth of our revenue is reinvested back into research and development, as China, as our largest market, whether we like it or not, fuels a lot of that innovation that happens here back home as companies take that revenue from China and reinvest it back into their workforce, their research, development, capital expenditures here in the U.S. So, it's as we think about these terms like decoupling, technology restrictions, the trade relations, sanctions, we also need to worry about how do we ensure our industry, like semiconductors or other key industries, have access to that China market. So those are kind of the key big macro trends right in front of us. I'm not saying they're easy; they're difficult. And it's going to take a lot of smart people from government, Congress, industry to work together to come up with the best approach.
In addition to a bilateral approach, are there other initiatives the administration might take, whether in WTO or other trade agreements, that would improve market access and deal with other trade issues relating to semiconductors?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the short answer is yes, both on trade expansion, but also on trade enforcement. On the trade expansion side, I think there's actually opportunity to work with China to expand trade in semiconductors. For example, the Information Technology Agreement as part of the WTO is a clear agreement that's benefited everyone that's party to that. In fact, 20% of growth in semiconductor trade we think can be attributed to the ITA, of which both the U.S. and China are a member to. And as digital technology continues to advance at a lightning speed, there's a lot of new technology that's not covered by the ITA. And in fact, we think there's a good opportunity to try and expand that in the future. And then we think there's an opportunity to, either with its in partnership with China or with our allies, to work within the multilateral trading institutions like the WTO to either strengthen the rules to address things like industrial subsidies or non-tariff barriers to trade, or to work maybe even some cases outside of the WTO to develop new plurilateral trade agreements if we just don't think movement is possible within the WTO. And then finally, if we think it's necessary and we think China's not living up to their commitments and things like subsidies or market access, transparency, we should bring those issues to the WTO and try and seek remedies. I know that's a really fraught topic with debate over the appellate body and different issues relating to the governance of the WTO. But our view is that we should try and give it a shot. We need to work through the existing multinational institutions that we have. As we saw in the last administration, when we try and work on our own, and progress in that area is incredibly difficult.
Well, thanks so much, Jimmy, for coming on. This is a lot of great info and fantastic ideas for us to think about. Really appreciate your coming on and looking forward to continuing this discussion as the policy debate evolves.
Absolutely. My pleasure to be here, and wish you the best of luck in the future of your podcast. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Jimmy. And that's it for this edition of Supply Chain University. You can find this in all of our videos at steptoe.com. You can also find us on YouTube, where you can like and subscribe. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you next time.